So good evening and welcome to the last session, the Friday of the third Eunoia Summit. I'm really pleased to have Dr. Michael Daw here with us speaking about consciousness. Let's not mess about here. I'm going to pass it straight over to Romy. Romy, over to you.
Hello and welcome everybody. I'm going to just say a tiny wee little bit about the Eunoia Summit. You should all be well versed in this now because I've said it every single talk that we've had. But for those that are joining on the recordings, welcome. So this is the third year of the Eunoia Summit, brought to you by the Centre for Spirituality, Ecology and Mental Health. Eunoia is an ancient Greek word for something more than goodwill or beautiful thinking. The word captures a sense of honourable reputation, empathy, and readiness to help. It emphasises that right speech and right thinking leads to right actions for the good of the community. We are a modest collective of researchers, teachers, practitioners, and fairies. I'm the fairy. Working together to provide heart-led and centered, low-cost and evidence-based resources to support the spiritual development and spiritual well-being of the community. In times of turmoil, uncertainty, and fear, the most important thing we can do is to come together to build caring and compassionate communities where we can grow together and become wise and more fully step into our courageous, authentic selves. In doing so, we are better able to support each other as well as our planet. These are not new ideas. They are ancestral threads belonging to the ancient wisdom traditions that are now finding more and more support in the scientific research of today. And I would really like to welcome Dr. Michael Daw to tonight. Michael is a parapsychology researcher, which includes a scientific investigation of phenomena such as telepathy, precognition, psychokinesis, near-death experiences, and reincarnation. Michael's current research focuses on how dietary practices, particularly fasting and vegetarianism, are associated with spiritual development and psychic experiences and abilities. Michael's career has spanned university senior management and supporting academic research, most recently at the University of Leeds, where he worked for the Bragg Centre, that's a lovely name, software engineer and a high school mathematics teacher. Along with Professor Chris Rowe, he is a recipient prize winner of the Institute of Noetic Sciences Consciousness Research Award, which is a very prestigious award and a significant sum. Michael has been active in the environmental movement for over 30 years, including standing for Parliament, for the Green Party in 1992, and more recently as trustee of Climate Action Italy and a founding member of Transition New Mills. He is particularly passionate about restoring and enhancing nature, for example, through mossy earth, and advocating for more plant-based diets for reasons of the environment, planet, personal health, and of course for the animals. And tonight we are very privileged to have a talk on consciousness. So yes, without further ado, thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you, Romy. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Philip, for hosting this. Wonderful aims. It's great. And so, yeah, thank you for inviting me. I'll just share my slides. So, can everyone see that? Yes, thank you. Thumbs up. Okay, so yeah, so my talk tonight. So thank you also everyone for coming along and hearing about this topic. Yeah, so my talk is about scientific theories of consciousness from the brain to universe. Yes, as Romy said, I'm the recipient of the prize from the Institute of Noetic Sciences last year for writing an essay with my colleague, Professor Chris Rowe. So that's just to credit him with the input to a lot of what I'll say. although he also doesn't get the blame for any mistakes I make, of course. So this is my my own presentation, but of course a lot of it is based on the essay that we wrote together, and that we were privileged enough to win first prize on. So anyway, here you go. So what I'll be covering tonight is, first of all, trying to define what consciousness is. Then talking about brain-based theories that say consciousness is essentially produced by the brain. Then I'll talk about what we call disturbing phenomena that seem to threaten the sort of paradigm of brain-based theories. Then I'll talk about theories of a non-local consciousness, theories that suggest consciousness may not be limited to the brain. Then a sort of summary of how effective are the theories that we covered. And if we've got time at the end, I'll talk about some proposals, hopefully to enhance the field and move the field on. So what is consciousness? Well, the sort of pocket definition, if you like, seems to be kind of coalescing around this kind of just one sentence, really. What does it feel like to be you? That is your consciousness. This came a lot from the philosopher Thomas Nagel, whose picture you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, who wrote a paper in the 1970s called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" So in other words, whatever might have consciousness has some kind of feeling of what it's like to be that entity. What is it like to be you? What is it like to be me? That is our consciousness. But what we did in the essay was we tried to kind of tease that out a little bit more into these 6 what we call defining features of consciousness. So what is consciousness? What is it? What might theories address? It's what are they trying to explain really about consciousness? So the first feature of consciousness that we talked about is that it seems to be private and personal and unitary. So I feel like I'm me. I don't feel like I'm anyone else. I seem to have my own thoughts, and I also seem to have been me for the whole of my life, for as long as I can remember. So that's the first feature of consciousness. Second feature is that we have subjective experiences. So for example, I can see the color yellow, or I can hear the sound of a skylark. I can smell coffee. So these are all experiences. They're all distinct experiences. They're all different from each other, but nevertheless, they're all subjective, phenomenal experiences. And in the consciousness trade, they call these qualia. We also seem to experience different states of consciousness. So at the moment, presumably we're all awake. So we're in a waking state of consciousness. But we also later on will be experiencing sleeping state of consciousness. We might experience other types of consciousness, like meditation or psychedelic states of consciousness if we take hallucinogenic drugs. So there are all these distinct states of consciousness that seem to have their own features, and they all seem different from each other, and we move from one to another. The fourth feature of consciousness is this what is called the zombie problem. So this is really an issue of why is there consciousness at all? So particularly if you come from the perspective that consciousness is produced by the brain, then and if you have a sort of an evolutionary model or sort of Darwinian model of life, then why did consciousness evolve? I mean, you can imagine life forms going about the place without any consciousness at all, and hence zombies, which are kind of like living dead, but don't tend to have consciousness, but yet they can function like a human. The fifth feature of consciousness is free will. So we seem to be able to act in the world. We seem to make decisions that are meaningful and have effects in the world. We have free will. Some people would suggest we don't have free will, but then theories of consciousness need to explain why it seems like we have free will, even if they say that we don't have free will. And the final feature of consciousness that we think theories should try and address is they should have some criteria really of what differentiates conscious entities and non-conscious entities. So what is the difference between a living thing that has consciousness and a non-living thing like a table that doesn't? Can they distinguish between them? Now, there are lots of theories of consciousness. So last year, this guy Robert Kuhn got a paper published where he tried to summarize what every single theory of consciousness that he knew of, and there are over 200 theories of consciousness that are in that paper. He said he was trying to capture every theory of consciousness, but I know for a fact that he missed at least one or two, because I've found some quite interesting theories that are not included here. So there's lots of different approaches to consciousness, lots of people trying to explain it in lots of different ways. So there's a lot of attention on it, certainly at the moment as well, a lot of excitement that science can possibly address consciousness and can solve it. But there are a lot of different approaches. Now, you'd be relieved to hear I'm not going to attempt to go through 200 theories of consciousness tonight. I will go through very few of them just to kind of hopefully give you a flavor of different approaches to this question. So the first type of approach to this question is, and it's the kind of mainstream approach really, it's what you'll read about in Scientific American or New Scientist, things like that, and in most academic papers. And it's basically suggesting that consciousness is produced by the brain. And there are different theories about how, what is consciousness when you're just thinking about the brain. These are the sort of four leading types of theory. They're not four distinct theories, but there's different theories within them. But there's sort of four leading theories that tend to get discussed most of the time. And the first three of these, higher order theories, global workspace theories, and recurrent processing theories, all suggest that consciousness is some kind of high level process in the brain. So that's essentially what consciousness is. Whether it's a meta representation, as in the first set of theories, or whether it's a global workspace, as in the second set of theories, or whether it's back and forth processing between different parts of the brain. In all these cases, it's essentially a high level process. And they say that that is essentially what consciousness is. The fourth type of theory suggests that the brain is like a prediction machine. So it says that basically your brain is constantly making predictions about the way the world is, and these predictions get refined upon sensory input, so that, and then it makes another prediction based on sort of updated information, and it continues like that. And there's, this is one that's particular, and Anil Seth is particularly keen on this. And anyway, they suggest that that is what consciousness is. So those are your kind of four main types of theory that get discussed. There's one other actually, which I won't be talking about, called integrated information theory, but we can maybe talk about that at the end if people are interested. But that's another one that gets discussed, but that's slightly different. But essentially, all of those four types of theory that are the most talked about in the scientific literature basically say that your mind is your brain. Or that your mind is created by your brain, it's produced by your brain. That's what your consciousness is. It's your brain. Now, Francis Crick, one of the co-discoverers of DNA, he called this the astonishing hypothesis. And he summed it up like this. He says, your joys and sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behaviors of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. You're nothing but a pack of neurons, he said, which sounds kind of vaguely like a kind of an insult. But anyway, that's what he said. However, even on their own terms, these kind of brain-based theories, they have been criticized by people within the same paradigm, really. So there were these two recent papers that came out reviewing these types of theories. So one of them criticized really the kind of experiments that are held around, that are conducted around these type of theories, saying there was a confirmation bias. In other words, these theorists, they run experiments about their theories and they tend to find what they said they would find, despite the fact that different theories contradict each other, nevertheless they're all finding evidence that supports what they're saying. So it was kind of criticized for a lack of rigor, really, in terms of the experimental stuff. But they've also been criticized for being a conceptual quagmire. In other words, these different theories seem to be trying to explain different aspects of consciousness. There's no real agreed definition of what consciousness is, which is partly why Chris and I kind of put this kind of framework together, because we thought that might help, really, in terms of kind of trying to define, well, what are we trying to talk about when we talk about consciousness? What theories, what should we be trying to explain when we talk about theories of consciousness? People have criticized them in even more kind of damning terms. So Don Hoffman, whose theory we'll talk about, he has his own theory of consciousness, but what he said at a conference I was at last year in Tucson, he said, as of now, no physicalist theory, that is no brain-based theory, can explain a single specific conscious experience. He said, we have these theories of conscious experiences that cannot explain any conscious experiences. So he's kind of very kind of withering, really, in his damnation of these types of theories. But there's other problems too. Most particularly, perhaps they're all based. Their starting point is the human brain. So they're very anthropocentric, and they don't entirely ignore animal consciousness, to be fair, but they kind of seem to pay kind of lip service to it, most of them. And of course, different animals have very different kinds of brains. And the more we look, it seems, the more we seem to find consciousness in other animals. So even consciousness in insects. So there was this paper that was released just a few years ago that seems to suggest that bumblebees engage in play. So you have these pictures of bumblebees rolling balls, and they seem to be rolling these balls just for fun. And some of them seem to enjoy it more than others. You know, they don't get any reward out of it. They don't get any food out of it. They're just doing it because they seem to enjoy it. So these pictures you can see, and including the one where they seem to be playing football, these are pictures from the paper itself. So, you know, perhaps bumblebees enjoy play. But it's not just bumblebees that seem to show signs of consciousness. Even single-celled organisms show really quite complex cognition at the very least, and perhaps even signs of consciousness. So this is a single-celled organism that seems to be able to, well, no, that it can solve mazes and find the shortest path through a maze. Perhaps other people have even suggested that plants may be conscious. So plants can communicate with each other. They can recognize their relatives. They can make decisions. They can learn. They seem to have memory. And again, the more we look, the more we seem to find even plants having these signs of consciousness. But there's an even bigger problem than this. So as well as all these kind of issues with brain-based theories of consciousness, it's possible that they might overcome all these those issues that I've talked about. But there are kind of bigger problems. So what if consciousness doesn't even need a brain? What if consciousness can transcend space? What if consciousness can transcend time? And what if consciousness can influence matter? Now, any of these, if any of these turned out to be true, then it would kind of blow a hole, really, in the idea that our consciousness is all in our skull. So let's have a look at some of the evidence for each of these. So first of all, does consciousness need the brain? So I'm just gonna give you a few sort of examples, bit of evidence for why these things might be true. So we have this thing much reported. Many people will be familiar with this idea of near-death experiences. So when people are close to death and they're kind of revived, maybe they've had a cardiac arrest or they're close to drowning, quite a large proportion, actually, if people are interviewed, have these near-death experiences. They report kind of common things, like there's a very kind of, it's become almost a cliche, really, of near-death experiences, this idea of going through a tunnel towards a light. But people report other things like meeting their dead relatives and so on and so forth, and other kinds of things. So Now, that's all very well. I mean, many people say that this is just an illusion or some kind of hallucination caused by the brain. Many people also report, by the way, the consciousness leaving the body and being able to see what's around them and so on. However, what's really intriguing is that sometimes people report leaving their body and seeing things that they shouldn't really be able to see. So we can later check. So let me give you an example of that. So I'll just read out. This is a direct quote from a paper. So someone said, this person who was quite ill said, I was in the hospital having had an operation for peritonitis. I developed pneumonia and was very ill. The ward was L-shaped so that anyone in bed in one part of the ward could not see around the corner. One morning, I felt myself floating upwards and found I was looking down on the rest of the patients. I could see myself propped up against pillows, very white and ill. I saw the sister and nurse rush to my bed with oxygen. Then everything went blank. The next I remember was opening my eyes to see the sister bending over me. I told her what had happened, but at first she thought I was rambling. Then I said there is a big woman sitting up in bed with her head wrapped in bandages and she is knitting something with blue wool. She has a very red face. This certainly shook her, as apparently the lady concerned had a mastoid operation and was just as I described. She was not allowed out of bed, and of course I hadn't been up at all. After providing several other details, such as the time by the clock on the wall, which had broken down, I convinced her that at least something strange had happened to me. So this is really, and there are other instances like this, really quite seemingly convincing evidence that this person's consciousness seemingly had left their body, had left their brain. So can consciousness transcend space? So let's have a look at that. So around a third of UK adults believe telepathy is possible. So by telepathy, I mean mind-to-mind communication, not by any other means. So around a third of UK adults believe that's possible, and almost 10% say they've experienced telepathy. Now, of course, people may be mistaken by that. Maybe it's just things just coincidental, or they're just mistaken, or wishful thinking, and all sorts of misremembering, and all sorts of things. So this is why people like me, parapsychologists, we run experiments to test telepathy in controlled conditions. So let me just run through an example of one of these telepathy type experiments. So there's an experiment called the telephone telepathy experiment. So let me try and describe it. So the idea is you get 5 people, preferably 5 people who know each other quite well. And one of these people is the receiver. So they volunteer to receive a telephone call. And it could be any one of those 4 people. So the guy who's down in the right-hand corner, he's receiving a telephone call. And it could be any of his 4 friends that are in the top left-hand corner. And what you do in the experiment is you select one of these callers at random, say by throwing some dice or by a computer generating random numbers. And before the guy picks up the receiver, he says who he thinks is calling. Of course, this is without, so I'm just trying to move this. This is without caller ID, obviously, because then it would be, you know who's calling before you pick it up. But this experiment was actually done before the days of caller ID. So if we're doing an experiment like this, you do this many, many times. And of course, by random, if it's just random, if there's no telepathy going on, you should be right 1 out of 4 times. So you should get a result of 25%, around 25% correct guesses or saying who you think's calling. So when you run this experiment, though, as this guy did, who made up this experiment with his colleague Pamela Smart, Rupert Sheldrake, in one experiment, he ran 571 separate trials. So in other words, 571 phone calls like how I described it. So if it was just chance alone, you'd expect 143 times that people would be correct. In other words, 25% correct. But actually in the experiment, people were right 231 times. In other words, they were correct 40% of the time. And using statistics, you can tell that the odds of this result happening by chance, well, it's not very likely. It's 1 in 4 I don't even know what that is. I did actually the last time I did this presentation, but anyway, I'm not going to try and work it out. 4 in a 1 in a very large number. So it's very unlikely you'll just get this result by chance, which seems to suggest telepathy is going on here. So that's telepathy. And consciousness apparently transcending space. Can consciousness transcend time? Well, we call that precognition. So if we seem to know what's going to happen in the future without looking at a weather forecast or something like that, but if we just seem to know of an event that might happen in the future, we call it precognition. Again, around about a third of UK adults believe precognition is possible. And again, around about 1 in 10, a bit more than 1 in 10, say they've experienced instances of precognition. So let me tell you about an instance of precognition by this guy, Mark Twain. So in his autobiography, he tells this story of what happened to him. So he said, he talked about how he had a dream. He said, I dreamt I had seen Henry, who was his brother, a corpse. He lay in a metallic burial case. He was dressed in a suit of my clothing, and on his breast lay a great bouquet of flowers, mainly white roses with a red rose in the center. So you can imagine he when he awoke, he was somewhat shaken. He went to the house in his dream where the casket, where he dreamt that the casket lay, and he realized, as he put it, there was nothing real about this. It was only a dream. However, a few weeks later, Henry, his brother, was killed after being burned in a boiler explosion. And Mark Twain talks about going to the house that he dreamt of. And he says, when he entered the dead room, Henry lay in that open case. And he was dressed in a suit of my clothing. He'd borrowed it without my knowledge during our last sojourn in St. Louis. And I recognized instantly that the dream of several weeks before was here exactly reproduced so far as these details went. And I thought I'd missed one detail, but that one was immediately supplied, for just then an elderly lady entered the place with a large bouquet consisting mainly of white roses, and in the center of it was a red rose, and she laid it on his breast. In other words, confirming exactly what he dreamt. So I'm going to skip past the, how are we doing for time? Yes, I'm going to skip past this next one. So the next one is just a description of an experiment to test precognition. And I can come back to it later if people are interested after the session, but let's move on. So can consciousness influence matter? We call this psychokinesis. This guy was well known for psychokinesis. Uri Geller. Interestingly, people who are quite young have never heard of Uri Geller, but when I was a kid, he was one of the most famous people in the world, and he was famous for bending spoons. So most people know about spoon bending. Well, this is the guy who invented it, supposedly with mind over matter. Now, whether or not he did that, this guy is a guy called James Randi, and he spent the latter part of his career really trying to debunk Uri Geller. Actually, reasonably successfully, because he did get Uri Geller on video supposedly cheating, where he was actually bending a spoon, under his bum, whatever, and doing that when he shouldn't have been. However, there's also some evidence to suggest that Uri Geller at least sometimes could bend spoons. But again, we don't know. It's hard to know. So again, we parapsychologists run experiments. It's quite difficult. We tend to focus, instead of focusing on things like spoons, on big objects, because people have a kind of, magicians can do that. It's actually, and magicians are very clever at doing that and kind of cheating us. So it's kind of best to avoid things that are kind of dramatic and people who kind of claim these things, although some people are trying to do that with that. So instead we use kind of just ordinary people off the street, and we we ask them to influence things that may be perhaps a bit more easy to influence than bending spoons, things like the roll of a dice, or random number generators generated by computers. So let me talk you through a kind of experiment we might do using random number generators on a computer. So a random number generator it's like tossing a coin really over and over again, except that it produces zeros and ones. So it randomly produces zero, then it will 0 or 1, there's 50% of the time it will produce zeros and 50% of the time it produces ones. And then you have your participant, like this person here, who tries to influence the computer to just produce ones. Or maybe they'll just try and influence the computer to just try and produce zeros. Either way, they're trying to influence what's going on in the computer, which in theory, you shouldn't be able to influence. That's kind of mind over matter. So you run experiments. By chance, you should expect people to get about 50% ones, 50% zeros. One study found 51% of the whatever people were trying to influence, which doesn't sound like much, but because it was over a very large number of trials, the odds of the result happening by chance was around 1 in 100. And there was an analysis of 377 separate studies like this, and they found the same effect. And again, the odds of this meta-analysis, as it's known, against chance is less than 1 in 1,000. So it doesn't look likely that this is happening by chance. So it looks like something might be happening here. And if you analyze, so there was this paper, so there's all these experiments in all these different fields. A lot of people have criticized them in various ways. Of course, there's not just the experiments that I've told you about, but lots and lots of experiments. And this guy, Etzel Cardenia, did a review of all these experiments of more than 5,000 studies on telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, psychokinesis. And he concluded, and it got published, by the way, in quite a mainstream psychology journal. He concluded, the evidence provides cumulative support for the reality of parapsychological phenomena, which cannot be readily explained away by the quality of the studies, fraud, selective reporting, experimental or analytical incompetence, or other frequent criticisms. He said the evidence for this kind of stuff is comparable to that for established phenomena in psychology and other disciplines. Now, we called it in our essay, we called these kind of phenomena disturbing phenomena. And we did that really, well, it was after this guy, Alan Turing, who wrote a sort of seminal paper in the 1950s that it's kind of almost like the birth of artificial intelligence, if you like. He coined what was called the Turing test, which is how you could possibly tell whether a computer had reached a human level of intelligence, which now people are predicting might happen within 1 or 2 years. But anyway, in that paper, the kind of seminal artificial intelligence paper, he mentioned one way that you might be able to tell the difference between a human and computer is because a human might be telepathic. So he wrote in this paper, he said, I assume that the reader is familiar with the idea of extrasensory perception, telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and psychokinesis. He said, these disturbing phenomena seem to deny all our usual scientific ideas. And he said, unfortunately, the statistical evidence, at least for telepathy, is overwhelming. He says, once one has accepted them, it does not seem a very big step to believe in ghosts. So because of these disturbing phenomena, if we accept that they are true, then they kind of knock a very big hole in those brain-based theories of consciousness. So that was a little bit of diversion, hopefully not too long of one. So we have other types of theories of consciousness, and the other types of theories of consciousness are theories that consciousness may be non-local. In other words, it might not be just in our brain or produced by our brain. It might be beyond our brain and therefore perhaps accommodate these kind of disturbing phenomena. So in our essay, so I've already talked about these brain-based theories of consciousness, but in our essay, we categorized other types of theories, these theories of a non-local consciousness in these types. So theories that said consciousness was related somehow to quantum mechanics, consciousness is hyperdimensional, consciousness is field-like, consciousness is in everything, and consciousness is all there is. So what I'm going to do now is just talk you through a few of these. I can't remember how many I put in, 3 or 4. I'll just kind of give you a flavor of these kinds of theories, really. So first of all, I'm beginning to wish I picked a different one actually than this. Oh, no, it's right. No. Sorry, ignore me. I thought I had different slides. No. So I'm going to give you a very quick and crash course in quantum mechanics, or at least I'm going to tell you about some of the kind of what's called the weirdness in quantum mechanics, which has led people to think that maybe it's got something to do with consciousness. So quantum mechanics, as many people will know, we wouldn't have our computing technology if it wasn't for quantum mechanics. So this is a theory of physics that has been shown over and over again to be extremely accurate and extremely reliable. Yet it also says very strange things about our world. So it says that our world is not predictable, like many people suggest that it might be, that it's fundamentally non-deterministic, that it can't be predicted, even if we had biggest computers in the world. It also seems to suggest that particles can be in two places seemingly at once or more. It also suggests that particles can be entangled. In other words, they seem to be part of the same system and they can influence each other, even if they are extremely far apart, even if one is at one end of the galaxy and one is at the other end of the galaxy. Nevertheless, if you do something to one of them, it seems to affect what the state of the other one. And that is known as entanglement. And there's also this thing called the double slit experiment. I'm not going to try and explain that, but many people have, and it's kind of what's called weird effects. People often come down to this word weird, because particle seems to be I'll show you what seems to happen. It seems to be what we might think of as a solid particle seems to be just a sort of statistical cloud of possibilities, really, that you can describe by an equation. And it only sort of collapses into a definite position, a definite kind of what we might think of as a solid object when we measure it, when there is an observation. Then it is a definite kind of thing. And the reason why I'm telling you all this is because of the first theory of consciousness that I'm going to talk about, the first theory of non-local consciousness, by Stuart Hameroff, who's a neuroscientist, and by Sir Roger Penrose, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics, is also a mathematician. And they suggest that what consciousness is this collapse of the wave function, but it's happening in microtubules. Now, microtubules you find in every living cell, but you particularly find them in neurons. And they say that they reckon that conscious experiences are when the quantum wave function collapses within these microtubules, and when it happens all over the brain at the same time through entanglement. And that's what a conscious experience is. Or actually, Roger Penrose is a bit more guarded and says only certain types of conscious experiences are this kind of quantum wave collapse. He says that it's the moment of understanding. So say if you like when you get a joke, that moment is a kind of collapse of the quantum wave function in microtubules in your brain. And what I'm going to do, by the way, with each of these theories is also have a hint at how they might explain some of this disturbing phenomena. So they have suggested that this idea of presentiment, which is like precognition but on a very small timescale, that this could be accounted for because you also see this kind of idea of time reversal, or time not kind of behaving in the way we would expect it to happen in quantum mechanics. So they suggest that conscious experiences, because of quantum mechanics, conscious experiences could be what they call temporally non-local with backward time effects. And consciousness may not follow the normal rules of sequential time progression. So this was in a scientific paper, so that sounds quite meaning, so that sounds quite wordy, really, and very academic speak. But basically, they're saying that your brain may be able to see the future, even though they're only talking about a few seconds of the future. But nevertheless, they're talking about your brain may actually be able to see something that hasn't actually happened yet, or your consciousness rather may be able to see something that hasn't actually happened yet. So they are accepting that possibility, although they are, to be fair, they're only saying that this could be a possibility. And that's what you get if you say that your consciousness is quantum mechanical, then you allow for all these kind of quantum weirdness to creep in as well to your consciousness. Other people suggest that consciousness is hyperdimensional. In other words, now we tend to think of our world as, well, our world kind of very much seems like it's three-dimensional, and Einstein's theory of relativity suggested there were 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time, and that's his theory. That's what his theory of special relativity said, and that's kind of what is the accepted theory in physics. Now, there are some theories in physics that are a bit more speculative, called string theories, that suggest there are many more dimensions than that, up to 11 in one set of string theories. But people who are interested in consciousness, some people have suggested, well, maybe consciousness is hyperdimensional. So Edward Close and Bernard Knepp have come up with this theory that they say consciousness is hyperdimensional. And in their theories, which they've developed, they've got a kind of quite advanced mathematical model. In their mathematical model, they say there are 3 dimensions of space. Well, that kind of makes common intuitive sense, because that's what we experience: up and down, left and right, and backwards and forwards. That's our 3 dimensions of space. But their theory also suggests that there might be 3 dimensions of time, which is a lot less intuitive. And in fact, you could actually say, well, time, a lot of people have said that time is kind of point-like. In other words, we only ever experience the present. And this is the kind of basis of mindfulness, or Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now, to suggest that time is point-like. And some suggest that you can kind of develop spiritually if you just focus on that idea. However, the fact that we have memories of the past, and that perhaps we have, we might know what's going on in the future in some instances through precognition and presentiment, might suggest that time is one-dimensional. In other words, it's like a line with kind of past, present, and future. So what is difficult? So that's perhaps one dimension of time. So what are these other 2 dimensions of time? Well, Close and Knepp suggest that the second dimension of time is when we make decisions. So in other words, our free will at every present moment could go off in different directions. So if you're thinking about a line being one dimension of time, well, if we make a decision, perhaps we go off that line into another direction, or we could go off in all sorts of different directions. And that's the 2 dimensions of time. And then you get 3 dimensions of time because you're interacting with, because we all interact with each other. So we all have 2 dimensions of time, and that kind of creates a right angles to that. So therefore you have 3 dimensions of time by the fact that we all have free will and we're all interacting with each other. So that's potentially what 3 dimensions of time might look like. But they also suggest that there are at least 3 dimensions of consciousness as well that is different. So you have these 3 kind of substrates. You have space, you have time, and you have consciousness. And how do these 3 things get linked together? Well, they say that they get linked through vortices, which is why I put a picture of a vortex on the screen. That's a vortex caused by SpaceX, actually. But anyway, you get these vortices. Other examples of vortices are things like whirlwinds or tornadoes or whirlpools in water. But they say that there are these vortices that are the kind of fundamental structures of reality, and they convey, or they can convey, information and between different dimensions. And using their theory, they think that they can explain unanswered questions in physics. For example, why atomic structures don't just fly apart. They think if you include consciousness in a model, in a physical model, then you can explain why atomic structures don't just fly apart. They also say that they can explain aspects of life, that they say that certain elements that we need for life, like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, have more of this kind of consciousness, what they call Gimmel consciousness, than other types of elements. And they say they can also explain things like dark matter and dark energy through their theory. Now, in terms of the kind of disturbing phenomena, well, they say, what does this mean? So things like telepathy that we talked about, well, they say that telepathy is information transfer via vortices across dimensions of consciousness. They also suggest that survival after death might be possible. You might have a disembodied soul, which is essentially a vortex in just consciousness dimensions. So in other words, my consciousness is kind of tethered to my physical body, and I'm living in time and I'm living in space, and I have a consciousness. But when I die, my physical body goes away, so the sort of the space and time aspects of me disappear, but I still perhaps exist just in consciousness dimensions with no spatial or time dimensions. How am I doing for time? Okay, I'll possibly stop earlier than I was going to, but let me go through another theory. So other people suggest that consciousness might be field-like. So this person, Diane Hennessy, also known as Diane Hennessy Powell, who some of you may have come across via a podcast called The Telepathy Tapes about autistic children who are seemingly telepathic. She has a theory of consciousness that suggests consciousness is electromagnetic waves, at least in part. Well, she says that actually consciousness is a kind of universal, non-local consciousness that is everywhere, but that the brain interfaces with that consciousness via electromagnetic fields. And she says the evidence for this is the fact that that the brain, lots of aspects of the brain seem to be electromagnetic. So the most obvious one, perhaps, there is brain waves are electromagnetic, which you can measure using an EEG. We produce electromagnetic waves, but we also, in common with all living organisms, we all produce photons. We all produce particles of light. That's what all living organisms do, and they're known as biophotons. And the reason why you can't see them is because we only produce a very, very small number. So even if you're in a dark room and you can't see the biophotons that someone is producing because there are just so few photons and our eyes can't pick it up. Nevertheless, we are all producing biophotons. And she suggests that these biophotons create a holographic field, and she suggests that these might be what some people can see as a subtle body or an aura. And that's essentially created by, she says, by biophotons. But she also says that that things like telepathy might be electromagnetic. So she says that telepathy might be caused by, or not caused, telepathy might be extremely low, what are called extremely low frequency waves. So these are types of waves, electromagnetic waves, that can travel extremely large distances, and they're very hard to shield. So what she says, if we have an antenna capable of detecting extremely low frequency waves in the same frequency waves as human brain waves, the possibility of telepathy does not seem to be as big of a stretch. Nonetheless, she says, if telepathy is real, why wouldn't more of us experience it? Perhaps the magnetite lining our skulls can also serve as a shield to protect the privacy of our thoughts and limit potentially undesirable outside influences. In other words, she says that there's this magnetite that there's like a membrane outside that is covering our skull. Perhaps that acts as a shield for electromagnetic waves in it. And she suggests perhaps it also saves us from being kind of overwhelmed with information that we might otherwise get. Which is why she also says, and she's run experiments on non-verbal autistic children, many of whom she suggests are kind of 100% telepathic. In other words, they can read minds, not just sometimes or occasionally, but constantly. But she suggests, or some people have suggested, that that's why non-verbal autistic children have such difficulty in interacting with the kind of normal world, because they're kind of almost overwhelmed with information. Anyway, that's a slight no, it's not. I was going to say it's a digression, but it's not really. So where are we? Do we have time for one more? No, let's not do Don Hoffman. So I will jump to my conclusions, or our conclusions, I should say. So after we looked at all these theories, what did we conclude? So we concluded that no theory of consciousness, whether it was brain-based or non-local consciousness, sufficiently accounts for properties of consciousness. So those six defining characteristics of consciousness, none of them are really very good at kind of accounting for. None of them can account for all of them, and most of them can't account for very many at all. However, brain-based theories in particular, they cannot account for disturbing phenomena. So they can't account for why our consciousness seems to be able to leave our body. They can't account for telepathy. they can't account for precognition and so on. However, many of the non-local theories of consciousness also fall short. So when you get these theories of consciousness describing it, they kind of say, oh yeah, we can account for telepathy. And maybe they can in principle, but they don't really spend much time trying to explain how they might work within their theory. I mean, Diane Hennessy is one exceptional, at least as regards telepathy anyway. She does at least suggest that it happens via extremely low frequency waves. Most of these theories of consciousness don't go into such detail, and Diane Hennessy doesn't bother. Well, I say doesn't bother. She doesn't explain other kind of phenomena. However, brain-based theories are generally better as scientific theories. So these types of theories are generally created by neuroscientists, by and people like that. So they come from a very kind of hard science background. So you would expect that they're kind of better scientific theories. By scientific theories, I mean they kind of make hypotheses, and you can experiment and you can test these kind of things are falsifiable, and so they're seen as better scientific theories. Although there are, to be fair, there are some theories of non-local consciousness who also kind of prioritize making hypotheses and so on, and they also fare well in this respect. I will impinge on a few more minutes because I will just finish on ways that we suggested that the field might improve, really, which is what I kind of promised at the start. So I won't go into this in detail, but we suggested, how can we make progress for theories of consciousness? How can we make them better? Well, first is we suggested there's a possibility of integrating theories. And the second was by doing more testing, really more focused testing, particularly on the theories of non-local consciousness and using kind of parapsychology. So let's quickly go through those. So if you have this idea that perhaps consciousness is kind of universal, those theories that suggest that perhaps, the idea is that perhaps there's value in all of these theories, that they're not necessarily exclusive. So you might have theories of a non-local consciousness that suggest consciousness is everywhere. Perhaps they're valid, but then you kind of have to explain how our brain interacts with those theories. So perhaps this is where the hyperdimensional and the quantum and the field theories come in. Perhaps they can explain the interface between our brains and a wider consciousness. And then the physicalist theories, the brain-based theories, well, clearly there's value in those theories. I'm not trying to say that there's no value, but perhaps what they're just describing is how the brain processes consciousness when consciousness gets there. So yes, they can't explain the disturbing phenomena, and there's lots of other problems with them as well, but clearly they're showing something about how the brain works. It's not like they have no value at all. So perhaps we should be integrating these theories of consciousness. The second thing, which I won't go through, but the second thing suggests that we should be, parapsychology can perhaps help in looking at these disturbing phenomena, because they do tell us some important clues about how consciousness works. So let's focus more on parapsychology. Let's focus more on these different things like telepathy, and let's try and nail down what they might tell us about what consciousness is and how consciousness works. So that was our second proposal, and some people have done this in the past, have made specific things, but not many. There we go. So thank you very much for your attention. Just about within the hour. And if you want to contact me, feel free to email me or have a look at my website and contact me there. But anyway, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Michael. This is absolutely fascinating stuff. And thank you for making it and distilling it down and making it so accessible and easy to understand in what is clearly, pardon me, a complex area. And conflicting ideas and potentially conflicting fields. For all of us, this is super important because it's through consciousness that we experience reality. So thank you ever so much. This is a beautiful way to end the week.
Well, thank you. That's very kind.
I'll pass over to Philip, and for any questions, please. So please, if there's something you want to ask Michael, put that into the chat or put your mic on, and in your hands, Philip.
Thank you very much, Lee. The one question about the bumblebee and nectar maybe come a bit later. All right. I do have a couple of questions on my own. It's so wonderful that this is the last day, because this feels like a home stretch, this conversation. Finally, something I can relate to, being a spiritual podcast. This is the stuff that I basically live off. So thank you so much, Lee, for putting this at the end of the week. And the first question I wanted to ask about the very last couple of minutes from your lecture, and simply naively asking, most likely, has there been a lot more money going into consciousness research on brain-based theory versus all alternative theories? This is basically, do we know so little because the money is flowing in one direction?
Oh, goodness, yes. I mean, to such a huge degree. I mean, yeah, I mean, you can get a lot of money for neuroscientific research projects around consciousness, and there's huge research teams, multiple PhD students on one particular, not even one particular theory, but one particular aspect of one theory. Whereas most theories of non-local consciousness, well, in fact, I would suggest all of them, they're kind of they're almost being done by people in their spare time. Or at least on very minimal funding. So it's perhaps not surprising that they're not, perhaps not as scientifically rigorous in the main. So yeah, this is the problem. Really. This is a huge problem, really, and it's a huge problem that we need a kind of paradigm shift. So I don't know whether people are aware of something called the Galileo Commission. So the Galileo Commission is it did a report several years ago now, but it did a report basically. So the idea of being Galileo, the reason why it's called a Galileo Commission is because this idea that Galileo came up with this idea that perhaps the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, and say, well, you just need to look through the telescope. And many people supposedly apocryphally said no, I'm not even going to look through the telescope. And it's kind of like saying similar things. Is we have all this evidence from parapsychology that suggests that the brain is, the consciousness may be wider than the brain, and yet people don't even want to look. They don't want to know about it. I mean, I could go on about this, but I will say actually, Anil Seth. So Anil Seth is kind of, he appears a lot in the media talking about consciousness, and he makes these very kind of dogmatic statements, really, that says, oh, there's no such thing as free will, and everyone goes, oh, yes, Anil's saying it, so there can't be. And it's not to say he's a very good neuroscientist, and he focuses a lot on this kind of predictive model of the brain, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that yes, the brain does make predictions, but it doesn't mean that you understand consciousness. And there's this big leap that people take, is that, oh yeah, I understand this bit of how the brain works, therefore the brain must produce consciousness. And he's one that he's been in a debate, for example, with Rupert Sheldrake, and Rupert has kind of challenged him to look at the evidence. And I mean, whether he has or not, he certainly doesn't seem to take it seriously, or doesn't seem to want to look at it properly. And that's the issue we have. It's a difficult thing. There's a bit of a taboo, really. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, but to maybe calm you down a bit, because with all of my guests who are basically at the other side of the aisle, all those telepathic and angel seers and all of it, I talk every day. Basically, they don't agree on anything either. So that's and they're ignoring each other findings. So I'm always trying to bring it down. This is like, if you all see angels, can we just agree how they look like? And it's impossible as well. So there we go.
Of course, and I think the relevance, though, is that because the sort of mainstream paradigm just dismisses this kind of stuff, it means that there's no access to funding from from government funding, for example, the research councils. You just can't get funding for this sort of stuff, which means that people are doing it on a shoestring. So to answer that particular point.
Before I'm going to give it to Ronnie, because I can't read that much with my bad eyesight, but just one last question for me. That was, while I was listening to you, did I understand this correctly? You talked about telepathy and the numbers of prediction, this and that, but did these tests been run by random people or people who claim to have these abilities? And if not, why, for crying out loud, so to say?
What do you mean? If
You made those tests about this telepathy. You made tests with people if they can have this ability or not, or the numbers changing on computers and stuff like that. But the question was, did you make this test with random people, how I understood your lecture, or did you search specifically for people who claim to have these psychic abilities? That I would be very interested if the numbers are different. That would be my field of interest. If people who claim to have psychic abilities and you run these tests, if then the results are higher than like with average population.
Yeah. Okay. So the answer to the first bit is in Rupert Sheldrake's test, they weren't particularly people who said they were particularly telepathic. So they were just, I mean, they were just people who wanted to take part in the test, so they were interested. But he made a point of, he reckons that telepathy is more likely among people who know each other very well, who, for example, who are emotionally bonded. So ideally members of the same family. In fact, there's a video online of him performing this test for a TV program, and he uses the 5 Nolan sisters. So it's quite an entertaining little piece where he describes the experiment in probably a more entertaining way than I did. There are people, yeah, there are people who try and perform sort of these parapsychology tests on selected participants who either claim to be better or should be better. And I think, I mean, I'm not an expert in this area, but my feeling is that you don't always kind of get really dramatic results that way. You kind of feel like you should. There are all these factors that supposedly make people better at these kind of tests, and sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. It's a kind of I think the jury's still out really on whether that makes a difference. Apart from anything else, when you start to test, even if people are kind of quite telepathic or quite intuitive, as soon as you put them in an experiment, it sort of goes away a little bit, or sometimes a lot. It's kind of performance. It's kind of like performance anxiety. You know, as soon as you say, right, you be telepathic, you know, and actually that means that people actually quite often perform better at these parapsychological tests the first time they do it, because they have no expectations, and then they kind of go, oh gosh, I've done really well there, and then they try again, but because they're trying, it kind of blocks it. So it's not kind of so straightforward as all that, really.
I don't want to steal the whole evening's time, but I have a huge problem with the answer, because most of these people that I'm talking to who claim to have these abilities making money every day, having schedule 3 o'clock, I'm now telepathic. So if you see that if they are in a test environment, they're basically all day long in a test environment. So this is, I think we need a lot more research. That would be great to have it, because a lot of people falling into this, and I think we would like to know what's there and what's not. So I really hope for more serious research.
Well, if you know of anyone, I mean, we just say this, if you know of anyone who says that they can reliably perform, say, telepathy or remote viewing reliably on their own, then I'd be happy to set up an experiment, a controlled experiment to test them. I think what happens sometimes is, as I say, that people don't really perform that well when they're put in that kind of controlled environment, or you get instances of fraud, and that's the difficulty as well. Because if people set themselves up as being, and so you need to be even more careful, really, especially with people who kind of like people like Uri Geller, who kind of made a living from being psychic, if you like. If these people are prepared to kind of put themselves in a controlled situation, then yeah,
All right, Ronnie, would you be so kind to ask the question? It's more than I can read.
Right. Actually, thank you very much. I've got actually a few little questions, but one of the things that I wanted to ask, just literally, if it's something that you had looked into, was when you were talking about the quantum wave collapse and the tubes. I really liked that fascinated me. And I was wondering, like in hypnotherapy, so if I may not have worded this very well because I'm absolutely rubbish at questions, but in hypnotherapy, there's a noticeable sense of time distortion and various other phenomena that you were talking about. I wondered if quantum wave collapse could then explain the things that come out of and from hypnotherapy. So could this be quantum wave collapse that then precipitates a new awareness and understanding, bringing a new consciousness to an aspect of someone's life, or even an overcoming of an issue? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. So I would say that Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose probably haven't addressed those particular issues. I mean, they did. The reason why I picked out the thing about precognition and presentiment was because that is one issue that they had, specifically. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, they kind of put down a lot of this to kind of quantum entanglement. So Stuart Hameroff is a lot more prepared to say this. Roger Penrose is he doesn't go this far. So there is a difference between them. He will kind of go, right, okay, I don't really want to talk too much about parapsychology. I think he says, I don't think that's helpful. That's the way he puts it. But Stuart Hameroff is a less guarded really about wondering about things. So he'll say that, yeah, maybe quantum entanglement or maybe these quantum effects are what's causing kind of different kind of parapsychological things. In terms of what you're saying in hypnotherapy, I'm not really quite sure. I think one theory I didn't cover is a guy called Bernard Carr, and he talks about this idea of the specious present. And I'll try and explain this. So the idea of a specious present is the idea that we think of a present as kind of one of kind of continual moments in time. But the idea of a specious present is that we can't discern below a very small period of time. So if you think about if a light is flashing on, in fact, you get this on a TV screen or even the computer screens that we're looking at, that they're flashing on and off all the time, but you can't see that because it's too fast for your eyes. So that's, in other words, it looks at the same time. So that's something that's happening below your kind of specious present, if you see what I mean. So it's like a granulation in time. And so the specious present isn't a point, it's a kind of block. And anything that happens within that block feels like happens at the same time. So his theory is that in certain states of consciousness, maybe that specious present extends, and maybe that explains precognition. So you might have a future event, and actually that's all in your specious presence. That's why you can access it. So maybe in hypnotherapy, people are kind of extending their specious presence, and it kind of changes like that. Does that make any kind of sense?
Yeah, that does, because there's because it's almost like, I think yesterday we had a talk about slow living and about how doing things that actually slow down so that you're more present in the moment, you're more consciously aware of things. And I think in hypnotherapy there's an altered state of consciousness when you go into that deep relaxation, and it's almost as if you're extending and slowing everything down, and then you actually have the ability to see those fragments. And almost that's why I was thinking about the quantum wave collapse, and if all of a sudden you've done that within your body and your mind, how that could then precipitate a change, because you've suddenly gone and you can see those moments and maybe the space in between those moments. And that really fascinates me.
Yeah, well, I would say that from what I know about it, the quantum theory that we were talking about in micro, I don't know how that would explain that in quite that way. I mean, maybe you could work it out, but I would say, as I say, Bernard Carr, a physicist, he's come up with a hyperdimensional theory of consciousness, not the one I talked about, but a different one. And I think that his theory is kind of idea of this specious present is possibly a better explanation for the kind of things that you're talking about.
Oh, thank you very much. And there was one other thing as well which I really am excited about, which is about what role could the microbial system on and within our bodies and on and within all other living beings play in consciousness. Because when you spoke about and obviously the research hasn't really been started to be done yet, I don't think. But the idea that initially we were talking about consciousness in humans, and now we're looking at animals, insects, plants, but has anything been done to look at consciousness on a microbial level? Because that it's only now really being looked into, the intersection between us and what's going on in our gut and our heart and our brain and on our bodies as well. And when you said about how telepathy, for instance, there seemed to be a better correlation between people that knew each other. I just was listening to something this afternoon, which was talking about the exchange of microbial systems between people that are close, and that touch is really important, because when you're touching somebody, you are exchanging microbes, and when you're kissing somebody, you are as well. So in that way, we could actually be sharing information and sharing support networks and possibly sharing consciousness through that avenue. And I just wondered if you know of any research that's being planned or that is going on in that field yet.
And also you get this idea of a gut feeling, don't you? So
yeah.
So yes, I don't know about it in detail. There is some research going on around, well, certainly around the gut brain axis, and telepathy is going on, and food is going on at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. I can't remember the name at the moment of the person who's involved. I want to say Garrett something, but if you're interested, drop me a line and I will find it. I mean, that obviously has crossovers with my other area of research around fasting and vegetarianism, because I think that might have an influence. But I think this comes down to, I mean, what the types of things that you're saying are kind of hypotheses, really. You know, and I that need testing, and that we need to think about how we might run experiments to do that, and so on and so forth. And this is where we need money and funding to do that, because I think all of those things sound really interesting, and yes, they do have relevance for consciousness. But as I say, apart from this piece of research that's going on in the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and I think actually from my memory of what they're doing, it's still at a really basic level, you know. But having said that, I mean, I went to a consciousness conference that was kind of half neuroscience and half parapsychology. It was kind of strange in Portugal. And we saw people talking about their neuroscientific research. And it made me realize how at such a low level it is of understanding, you know, when people talk about how much we understand the brain and so on, we don't really. we know such a small amount. And I was amazed actually hearing these kind of neuroscientists thought, is that it? You know, they kind of they think they understand the whole of consciousness. It's so incredibly arrogant actually, when actually they're kind of only understanding very small bits about how the brain works. So anyway, we're just at the very just as I say, I think it's really interesting what you've said. I've not really heard about that, those kind of things, and I think they would all make really good kind of,
because I would love to have a conversation with somebody about this, because also I have a theory about the connection with autism as well. And with this, and with it's just something that's been percolating. Something that's been percolating actually for probably about 18 years. So it takes me a while to formulate my idea, but it's because I've got a history of autism in the family, and things that I've noticed with my daughter through changing certain foods, and I hadn't realized that actually it's not necessarily the food, it's actually the ability. What I was giving her was the ability to change and impact her microbial system, which then had an impact on her ability and to interact. So, and I didn't know any of that. It's just now looking back and going, now that makes sense. I was from a completely different perspective. So, and also, so I'm really, really interested in that field.
Well, why don't we talk? I mean, not now, obviously, but more in detail. But if you're willing, then it would be great to
Yeah.
have a meeting with you and talk about that in more depth.
Yeah, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Before I'll give it a little bit to Lee, because you popped in a couple of questions, but the last things you said was quite resonating very strongly with me, simply because I've been a spiritual practitioner for a really long time and teacher, and I talk every day with these people, and they have formulated just out of their own experiences their own theory about mind and brain and things like that. They're not scientific. They're just basically I teach 30 years of meditation, so something comes to my mind if I want or not. And I think Lee is onto something about interdisciplinarian, because as you said, there's some certain arrogance or certain wisdom among some parts of the scientific community, and some this and that. And I think there's a lot of knowledge out there by real world practitioners, but it's not scientific. And as you again said, money. So there are three elements, not enough money in this area. There's not enough crossover maybe between outside and academic world. So with these last thoughts of mine, I'll pass it over to Lee and say thank you. This was a very, very exciting thing for me to hear, because this is my daily stuff in a way, just on the academic level. And I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much.
Can I just comment on that then? So I mean, I agree. I think that there's an incredible amount we can learn from spiritual practitioners. And anyway, so I just think if we had more money, if we had more funding. I just think I mean, I haven't got my own theory of consciousness. I mean, I have ideas like anyone has. I have kind of my preferred ones. But people who are theorists of consciousness, it would be good for them to be, I think, listening more to people who are kind of advanced spiritual practitioners, should we put it, or at least people who are advanced meditators and so on, who spent kind of professional introspection, because there's an incredible amount to learn, I think. So anyway, I agree. That's
being
a
arrogant.
long way of saying I agree.
Being arrogant, but I kind of actually think it's true, because so many times people like me develop, they must probably wrong, it doesn't matter, but we develop theories of consciousness, because that's what we're seeking for, because we're meditating for years to try to have a higher understanding. So we develop certain theories of what we're actually trying to do. They might be right, they might be wrong, but it would be fantastic to actually test some of them. And so this exchange, I think, would be great for all of us.
Yeah, I agree. So I will say something else about that. So recently I gave a talk at the Arthur Findlay College. So Arthur Findlay College is of spiritualist mediums. And the talk I gave was around diet. So it wasn't around theories of consciousness, but they seemed to like it. So I was asked back next year and said, well, why don't you talk about theories of consciousness? And my idea was similar to what you're talking about. So you basically have a bunch of mediums who are kind of advanced spiritual practitioners in a way, who will have their own ideas about consciousness. And what I wanted to do, what I was going to suggest to do, is that you have we present some of these theories in more depth. So, rather than just a broad outline, is what I did today, but present them in more depth, the ones that I think are most promising, and actually get people's, opinions on it, and get people's, not just opinions, but see where the linkages might be, and see whether the commonalities might be, what people think might be right and what might be wrong, and so on. So in a similar way to you're talking about. So I would be, again, I would kind of be open to having that kind of workshop of kind of presenting, as I say, different theories of consciousness and getting the views of people who are, advanced spiritual practitioners, and maybe with someone else, and we can kind of, have a research paper out of it, and, actually do some analysis of transcribing of what people said, about their own experiences and about their own introspection, as I say, what they might have to say about different theories of consciousness. So again, if you want to work with me on that,
I'd love to, but I stop here because I could talk on hours. I want to give it to Lee, but just the last sentence. I'm so sorry, Lee. It's exactly what you just said right now. If you come with a prepared script, because having people like me talk, it might not be that productive. We do not have the words, we don't have the background and the structures. We know what we feel and we know what we aim for, but we do not have the right lingo and all the background that you have. So actually, I think people like you could help us understand us better in what we're trying to aim or to do. So framing questions would be such an amazing way to do it. And that's the last thing I'm saying. So sorry, Lee, it's now 100% you.
No, but I'm sorry, it's not actually, because I just think that's really exciting, actually. And it's something that I don't think I could do by myself. I mean, I'd be happy to prepare some slides and help run the workshop and present and do that. But I think I'd like someone else, if there was someone else to come in with me and help, help transcribe it, help analyze what people might say. I think that actually might be a really valuable piece of research, actually. So if anyone on this,
I was going to say I think that would be brilliant, because I do divine healing and Reiki, and I did used to sit in a psychic circle years ago and do meditations, and what we tended to find was we would all sit in a circle and we'd go on a journey, so it was like a shamanic journey, and then we would bring our journey back into the group. And what we'd find was it was weekly, and after about 6 months, we tended to find that we were having very similar interrelated journeys, and that we would be seeing each other in our journeys that we were having, which was, and it was so fascinating. And then something even weirder happened. We were actually dispersed, and we were dispersed by if I were to say, we were dispersed by spirits. So we were actually ended up being dispersed by other beings around us. In one moment, the door started knocking and there was no one there. Then a kettle that was on the side that wasn't plugged in started to boil, and the switch started to go off and on, and we were all just looking at it, and it wasn't even plugged in. So there were all things that started happening when we got to this level of work together, and we ended up being like literally disbanding completely, and we've never met up again since, which was about 7-8 years ago. But it really fascinated me at that point of connection, and the fact that I wanted to do more research into it. I didn't at that time, I hadn't gone into or I think it was just before I'd gone into university, and I didn't even know that there was anything such as parapsychology. Otherwise I would have studied that. So, but I think as Philip was saying, it's so beautiful having, and Lee, the interdisciplinary sort of, and that integration, because I think that's so needed. And otherwise I found university to be quite elitist, and it really separated and isolated people. And I actually found myself falling out of my body and into my head because I had to, in order just to get through. And it really alienated me, because I felt at that point that I had to choose, and it's not a point of choosing, it's actually a point of coming back together. So it would be really good to do something, to organize something, and moving forward, I think that would be beautiful.
I think that sounds pretty exciting, actually.
Can I make a very arrogant statement? I have to, I'm so sorry. But it feels to me sometimes that, like, a field research for gorillas and nobody goes into the field. Because we spiritual practitioners, we've been the last couple of thousand years trying to understand our mind, coming Eastern tradition or whatever we come from, and people who want to understand consciousness, we are the guinea pigs, or we should be the guinea pigs. So there must be an interlinking. I just wanted to be absolutely just what Romy said, and just bring it maybe on a television prompt.
I think that's slightly harsh, actually. I mean, certainly increasingly people like myself and Chris Rowe and Cal, I know, and others are doing that. So,
well, let me dive in and say thank you once again. Michael, we'd love to have you back. And this for us is what the Eunoia Summit is about. It's coming together in community, it's sharing ideas, it's finding different ways in which we can collaborate and interact and just move this whole agenda forward. So thank you deeply from all of us for finishing this week so wonderfully. And I want to also just take this moment to say thank you to everyone that's come this week, everyone that showed up, that has been here, that has been absorbing this. Can we put our microphones on in our honoured tradition and give a warm round of applause to Michael for finishing this week so brilliantly? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me, and thanks for the conversation just now as well. So it's exciting thoughts.
It's a pleasure.
I was gonna say, Lee, we're not gonna have Michael back because we're actually not gonna let him go.
Oh, like it. I like it. This is the way
We've kidnapped you
forward.
now.
Yeah. We'll grab people and capture them. Just to say, there will be a release of recordings later in the year. We're not absolutely sure when the date of that is going to be because we're going to try and make a bit more of a big deal about it. And also to say that this is the last time the Eunoia will be happening quite in this format. If you've been with us in this journey for the last 3 years, you'll notice that we are slowly growing, we are slowly learning from our experiences, and we want to make this a little bit more professional, well, a lot more professional, as you can tell from my efforts in this space. But we want to make this a little bit more special. So next year there will be some changes. It's looking to grow. There will be new partners coming into this, and we will be making it even better for you. So please stay with us. We'll be sharing more information that people have shared. Michael, if it's okay, can I put a link to your paper on this?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, the essay. Yeah.
Brilliant. We'll put that on the website.
Yeah.
Other people have asked us to share things, so do keep coming back to the website, and you'll see in the coming weeks it will be populated with materials that we're sharing.